organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, strive for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. Today, we're taking a look back at the Frey Bender years. I want to start by looking at the Minneapolis Police Department. The City Council's most direct power relationship to the MPD is its power over the city budget. The way our city budget works is that the mayor, in our case Jacob Frey, proposes an initial draft of the city budget. Then, over a period of several months and 3 public hearings, the City Council makes changes, amendments, and adjustments to that budget, and after those changes are made, the City Council votes to approve the final budget. There are 13 seats on the Minneapolis City Council, and they need 7 votes to pass legislation, including a budget. The mayor can veto any decision by the city council, including the budget, unless there are 9 votes, which constitutes a veto-proof supermajority. Let's look at how this council and how Mayor Frey dispensed of their authority over the Minneapolis Police Department budget. To do that, let's step back in the time machine and go back to November of 2018. We're sitting at the first budget hearing of this newly seated city council. Lisa Bender serving as president and Jacob Frey serving as the mayor. This 2018 budget hearing is very historically significant because this is where the campaign to divest money from the Minneapolis Police Department really enters the public arena. Reclaim the Block burst on the scene as a collective organized around a clear and galvanizing demand to cut the MPD budget by 5%. I was at these hearings in 2018. This was pre-COVID, so there was hundreds of us downtown, packed for hours in City Hall to raise our voice in support of the 5% divestment. Speaker after speaker came to the podium to name the litany of harms and abuses perpetrated by the MPD and to add their support to the call for 5% reallocation from the MPD budget. All 3 public hearings in the 2018 budget cycle were energized. There were strong mobilizations of public support for the 5% divestment and also the seeds of the counter-mobilization by MPD seeking to defend its dominant position in the city budget. In order to really understand the stakes of this 2018 budget, we have to jump farther back in our time machine to 2015, to the 18-day occupation of Plymouth Avenue outside the 4th Precinct building in North Minneapolis. In November of 2015, we built barricades and fires that burned 24 hours in protest and blockade of the 4th Precinct in response to the murder of Jamar Clark on November 15th by Minneapolis police officers Dustin Schwarzy and Mark Ringenberg. It's hard to put into words how profoundly the murder of Jamar Clark and the occupation of the 4th Precinct influenced the politics in Minneapolis from 2015 onward. Definitely it shaped the 2017 municipal elections that seated this council we're evaluating, and it left many embers burning, one of which expressed itself as the intense battles over the city budget. Now let's jump back to 2018, the first budget cycle of the Frey Bender years. How did this struggle turn out? What were the demands raised by community? What did Frey propose? And what did the council amend? And what was finally approved by the city council? Jacob Frey's original proposed budget called for a $6 million increase to the Minneapolis Police Department. This was met with the historic Reclaim the Block campaign mentioned above, calling for a 5% divestment, which would be roughly $9 million that would be moved away from the police department and invested into social programs. After some of the most intense and well-attended budget hearings in modern city history, the city council ended up voting unanimously 13-0 to approve a $5 million budget increase to the MPD, increasing the Minneapolis Police Department budget from $179 million to $184 million. It's important for us to name and understand that this was a unanimous vote for a budget increase. But to get a better understanding, we must look at what the city council did in their markup sessions. What amendments did they try to pass? Did anyone even try to move on the community demands of divestment? What the historical record shows is no. The most aggressive move made by the city council to amend the budget was taking $1.1 million away from Frey's proposed $6 million increase and moving it to the health department to create the Office of Violence Prevention. This was an amendment moved by Cunningham and Fletcher and approved by the council. No council members put the demand of a 5% divestment up to a vote. No council members proposed any amendment to cut MPD's budget. We can see this first budget hearing of the Frey-Bender years set the stage for what was to come. Frey proposing a belligerently pro-police budget, activists making strong demands for divestment, and city council coming down much closer to Frey in its final vote. The strong Reclaim the Block campaign did notch a partial victory in 2018. They reduced the amount of increase to MPD by $1.1 million. So instead of Frey's proposed $6 million raise, the MPD instead got a $5 million raise. But still, that's a multi-million-dollar budget increase, a far cry from the demand of 5% divestment. Let's go to the next year. The 2019 budget cycle was perhaps even more intense. In 2019, Frey's proposal was again aggressive, calling for a massive budget increase and to hire 14 more police officers. Reclaim the Block again organized a strong campaign for divestment, disrupting the mayor's initial budget address and organizing hundreds to all three public hearings to call for no increase to the MPD budget. How did the council amend Frey's budget this time, and what did they approve? The city council unanimously voted on Frey's proposed $8.2 million increase for 14 more officers. I went back and looked again closely at what happened in the budget markups to see if the city council tried anything to counter Frey's proposal, and the answer is a dismal no. The only amendment put forward by city council that seek to reduce Frey's proposed $8.2 million increase was put forward by Bender, Ellison, and Gordon, and that was to move a tiny $500,000 away from that increase, and that was defeated by the city council. There was no motion put forward at any time in the process by any city council member that carried anything near the community demand for divestment. So at the end of 2019, only 6 months before George Floyd was murdered, after hours and hours of testimony calling for divestment, the Minneapolis City Council unanimously approved Frey's request for 14 more officers and increased the MPD budget by more than $8 million to $193 million. I'd like to share that I remember both of these budget cycles viscerally. I participated in both and testified at the public hearings. I painfully remember attending an event commemorating local artist Ricardo Levins Morales in December of 2019, after that final vote that increased the MPD budget by $9 million. I remember feeling despondent and defeated. I remember being opened up by Ricardo's words and art and being unable to hold back my tears. I broke down in the back of the room. I remember crouched down, hiding, sobbing with frustration at the intransigence of the liberal consensus at City Hall. None of these so-called progressive champions were even willing to put our demands up to a vote. That moment really stuck with me. And that's why I felt sick to my stomach in June when the city council took the stage at Powderhorn to make the obviously empty pledge to dismantle the MPD. We had all just watched them for 2 years in a row pump more and more money into the Minneapolis Police Department. How could anyone believe them now? Of course, the claim they made on that stage of a veto-proof majority was false, and they started walking back their hollow pledge immediately. That summer, there was a special budgeting process because of the COVID pandemic. Never was there a more ripe time to cut the MPD budget, and again, the city council failed. It didn't even try. You can go back in our podcast and listen to an interview we did with Sheila Najad and Karina from Reclaim the Block. That looks at the 2020 budget battle, where the community put forward the redistributive people's budget, which again was not taken up by the city council, who managed to avoid any cuts to MPD while other city departments were being slashed. Now I want to quickly look at this last budget cycle that just ended in 2021. Again, you saw Jacob Frey put forward a fascistic increase in MPD funding, a whopping $27 million. And this lame duck city council was unable to make any changes to it. There was one thing that was different about this last budget cycle. That is that 4 council members broke with the consensus and voted no on the entire budget. Every budget before that, 2018, 2019, and 2020, passed with a 13-0 unanimous vote. In this last budget cycle, 4 city council members, Lisa Bender, Jeremiah Ellison, Philippe Cunningham, and Cam Gordon, voted no on the final budget, and they cited the increase to MPD as their reason why. I think this is important because it could set a precedent for future council members. Before we get into too much celebration of those 4 no votes, I want to just be clear that that was 4 years too late, and every argument put forward for voting no on the 2021 budget applied in 2018, 2019, and 2020. So to sum up the Frey-Bender years in terms of the Minneapolis Police Department budget, the main way the city council has power over the MPD, what we saw was the DFL establishment pour money and pour resources into the Minneapolis Police Department, and really no difference between the progressive quote-unquote wing of the council and the conservative wing of the council. We had 3 13-0 consensus votes, and at the end of the day, we have a much more well-funded police department than we had when this council was seated. Now I want to move over and talk a little bit about housing policy. Again, we have to understand the political context that this council was presiding in and presiding over. When these council members were campaigning to be elected in 2017, renters in Minneapolis had already experienced 10 years of steadily increasing rents and stagnating incomes, with rents rising most dramatically for those in the bottom quartile of wage earners. Displacement from rising housing costs, gentrification, and the corresponding increase in houselessness were already evident at crisis level as this council took office. Perhaps the most signature policy of the Bender-Frey years is the 2040 plan, which outlaws single-family zoning in Minneapolis. The elimination of single-family zoning has made national headlines and has been celebrated by urbanists and liberals across the country as a progressive step forward. There is a connection between single-family zoning and the legacy of restricted racial covenants in housing. Neighborhoods zoned exclusively for single-family lots were often blasted with white-only covenants, creating privileged enclaves on the outside edges of the city and in the suburbs. Wrongly, though, The argument is made that the elimination of single-family zoning is redress to this legacy of restricted racial covenants and racial discrimination in our housing market. The elimination of single-family zoning was driven by the real estate industry and their political expression in the market urbanist movement. This was a market upzoning of the entire city. All this change does is allow for more units to be built on a lot. It has no redress or reparation for the legacy of apartheid in our housing market. It does not put restrictions or mandates on how new units must be allocated to undo these white supremacist patterns. While marketed to the public as a racial equity measure, the elimination of single-family zoning is about real estate profits and market growth. Recently, the Association of Neighborhood and Housing Development published findings from New York City that demonstrate plainly what was to be expected in upzoning's impact. That blanket upzoning brings a flood of private capital that drives up land value, drives up the cost of housing, and accelerates gentrification. That is the intended purpose. The market upzoning of Minneapolis neighborhoods will benefit the landlord class, but will make life harder for the already struggling masses of houseless people, of renters, and of working class mortgage holders. I want to be clear that I'm not defending the institution of single-family zoning. What I'm doing is criticizing the specific form of market upzoning enacted by this council. Here's an anecdote from the last 4 years that I think proves my point. In 2018, national publication The Hill and the right-wing National Builders Association came to town to host a forum on housing policy, and it featured Lisa Bender, Jacob Frey, and Republican state legislator Kurt Doubt. Mr. Doubt is known in Minnesota as a right-wing troll with a Trumpist politic, often using Minneapolis as a target and boogeyman in his racist grievance-mongering. One piece of praise that Mr. Doubt had for Minneapolis was his celebration of the elimination of single-family zoning. The National Builders Association is a major Trump donor, yet they excitedly platformed Frey and Bender as models for housing policy. Because while the liberal politics represented by Bender and Frey differ from the right wing on some mostly social issues, they have profound consensus around capitalist economic policy, specifically around the primacy of the private market in housing and real estate. With context, we understand that the 2040 plan and the market upzoning of the city is a right-wing maneuver. A corresponding policy initiative of the Frey-Bender years was the most aggressive privatization of public housing in the country. Bender and Frey co-wrote an appeal to Ben Carson, Trump's appointed director of HUD, asking for an exemption on limitations, which was approved. And because of that, they put 100% of the single-family home public housing stock into the Section 18 demolition and disposition program. This means that the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority creates a nonprofit and then sells off its assets to that nonprofit so it can manage them outside of the restrictions put on a public housing authority and bring in private capital. Along with Section 18 demolition and disposition, this council aggressively pursued RAD, rental assistance demonstration. They took 2 towers in South Minneapolis, Elliott Twins, and privatized them, inviting in partial ownership from the Royal Bank of Canada, a major investor into Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. I recommend going back to episode 14 of our show with Kaha from Defend Glendale to learn more about these programs. What's important for us to note here is the ideological and political consistency of the market upzoning of the city and Section 18 and RAD initiatives. Both are policies that rely on and engage private capital to exercise power and control over land and housing. Both are neoliberal market maneuvers. Cheerleaders of this council will point to the inclusionary zoning policy they passed as a progressive victory for housing. I'd like to dispel that notion. The inclusionary zoning policy is a band-aid on the bullet hole caused by the market policies of this council and their predecessors. What this policy does is it mandates any new construction with 20 or more rental units set aside 8% of those units as quote-unquote affordable at 60% of the area median income, or 4% of those units at 30% of the area median income. Developers can, of course, pay a fee in lieu of meeting any of these requirements. These affordability requirements are temporary, only applying for 20 years. Just on its face, you can see that it's ridiculous to call this policy significant for working people in need of housing. What we get is a paltry percentage of units set aside at prices that are temporarily reduced, but still too expensive for the poor and working people most in need of housing in this city. What we see here is the marketing heavy, but benefit light substance of the Frey Bender years. The words affordable housing get splashed across our screens, while our neighborhoods see a proliferation of top-of-the-market housing and higher rents. I recommend going back to our interview with Sam Stein to learn more about inclusionary zoning, gentrification, and housing policy. I decided I'm not going to talk about rent control too much on this episode. We're going to talk about rent control a lot in 2022. But what needs to be understood is that this council completely dragged its feet on rent control, and once they could no longer ignore the movement, they worked to sabotage and water down the renter-led rent control process. We'll tell that whole story in the new year. If you have questions about it, reach out to me. I want to talk about a few other moments from the last 4 years that I think are important. There were some moments of potential departure from the neoliberal consensus, moments when we could have did things differently. The Upper Harbor Terminal is one of those moments. The Upper Harbor Terminal was greenlit in the winter of 2018-19 after a fierce struggle and opposition. It was this struggle that birthed the Money, Power, Land Solidarity podcast. When the concept plan was approved in 2019, United Properties, owned by the billionaire Pohlad family, seized opportunity and assets in North Minneapolis at the expense of every other option for those 48 acres. There was a clear demand from the community to walk away from the deal with the Pohlads in First Avenue to pursue an eco-harbor concept with a coalition of grassroots organizations. After impressive organizing that included a community festival on the site of the Upper Harbor, community tours of the site, and an energized community forum that had both Jeremiah Ellison and Philippe Cunningham, the Northside Council members, on the hot seat, the vote for the Upper Harbor concept plan was delayed. This was the incredibly powerful moment, the crack in the consensus, a real sustained challenge to the practice at City Hall of granting and selling land to the wealthy white developers. This is where contingency came into play. The vote was delayed because council members were responding to pressure, unable to justify a yes vote. So what came with that delay? What happened in those pregnant 2 weeks? What would the council members deliver? A committee. Rather than vote down the project and walk away from the Pohlad deal, council members greenlit the corporate plan, but created a committee that was tasked with looking after the community interests in the development moving forward. The committee members were appointed by the city, and committee members all had to agree to the basics of the deal in order to join. They had to agree that the Upper Harbor was exclusively the right of United Properties in First Avenue. They had to agree that there would be a concert venue on site, even agree to the size of the concert venue, and they had to agree that there would be a mix of market and temporarily affordable housing. This committee was clearly a tool of co-optation. The development proceeded on track, And this committee with ornamental power was used to give the development a veneer of community collaboration. There was no political representative on the council that was willing to vote no, that was willing or able to challenge the capitalist orthodoxy on behalf of the community that had organized so hard. You can go back through our early episodes for more info on the Upper Harbor Terminal. Another such moment existed around the East Phillips Water Yard. You could go back to episodes 60 and 79 to get a full history of this rich struggle. In summary here, the city of Minneapolis has been pushing to expand the industrial operation they have running on 28th and Cedar in the East Phillips community. East Phillips is home to one of the largest urban Indian communities in the nation, along with many other working class communities of color. East Phillips has been the site of environmental racism for years, where the city has stuffed its most toxic industries. The community has been organizing for years in opposition to the city's water yard expansion, and they collectively built an alternative proposal for the site that includes an urban farm and housing. This struggle reached its peak in 2021 as the Frey-Bender era was coming to a close. The East Phillips Neighborhood Institute and allies led an impressive campaign in support of their urban farm proposal, generating the most public comments for a council vote in the city's history. There was incredible political momentum and will to do something different here, to walk away from the water yard expansion. But again, we saw this council resist pressure from below and march forward with the capitalist consensus that they inherited. The appointment of City Attorney Jim Rowater is another really consequential moment in these last 4 years that deserves our attention. In the summer of 2020, Jacob Frey put forward Target Corp executive Jim Rowater as his nomination for city attorney. A simple Google search, you'll find that Jim Rowater, as the head of labor relations for Target, has a documented history of union busting, and he was also a Target Corp executive while they were aggressively collaborating with the Minneapolis Police Department, with the FBI, and the Hennepin County Attorney's Office on incredibly racist practices of mass surveillance and mass incarceration. Now, the city attorney is a political position. The city attorney is often involved in the policymaking process, advising city council if they think a potential legislation could bring the city into legal trouble. This is often used by property owners and conservative forces in the city to delay progressive policy making. So in 2020, we have this consequential appointment, and Jacob Frey puts forward a union-busting Target Corp executive. What does the city council do? They approved Jim Rowater unanimously. You could go back and listen to the appointment hearings, and nobody even raises a critical question. This to me is really revealing about the politics of this council. Nobody was alarmed that this Target Corp executive was being put forward as the city attorney. Nobody rallied their community in opposition. Nobody even asked a critical question, tried to engage community in the process. Every single city council member rubber stamped this appointment. Now at this point, they already knew that they were going to have the Yes for Minneapolis charter fight on their hands. They knew they were going to have the rent control charter fight on their hands. And they know that the city attorney is going to get involved in those decisions. So how could we take them seriously that they wanted to pass question 2 when they rubber stamped and greenlit an obviously conservative corporatist city attorney? I cannot. This is again another moment that showed the profound consensus between all 13 city council members and Jacob Frey. These are all Democrats, all members of the DFL, and all capitalist market ideologues. There might be some differences between them, but they have much more in common than they have in difference. There's obviously a lot more that happened in the last 4 years. I can't cover everything. I think this is where I'm going to keep my comments. I want to stress that last point, the consensus that we saw in the Frey Bender years. 2021, you saw a lot of fighting between the council and Jacob Frey. I think that's a distraction. If you go back and look at the last 4 years, you saw 13-0 votes. You saw development projects approved unanimously. You saw political appointments approved unanimously. And you saw a shared neoliberal agenda moved by the council and moved by Frey. Another thing that stood out to me the last 4 years that we want to touch on more as we do the show is to recognize that the elected officials are not the most powerful actors in the city enterprise. There's tons of staff that work in the city departments. CPED, for example, that does all the real estate deals. This is a huge source of power in the city that often frustrates attempts to do something different. These people are trained in the capitalist orthodoxy. These people are salaried, professional, managerial class bureaucrats. And if we really want to do something different, we have to contend with these people. We have to figure out how to defeat these people. I think that's going to be a challenge for the 3 DSA electeds that are now serving on the city council. I think just my last quick reflection is really for us and for me to resist the allure to think that change is going to come from downtown, that change is going to come from elected officials. We do have 3 socialists now elected to the city council, but we need to ground ourselves and be clear that they're at a disadvantage at City Hall. And if they're going to be able to get anything done, it will only be because we have a mass movement that creates so much pressure, so much disruption in the streets that they have to do something. And hopefully what's different in the next 4 years is there's different political leadership that can take advantage of the opportunities created by mass movement. What we saw this last year was the complete failure of liberals and Democrats and their counterparts in the nonprofits to put forward anything different in terms of political leadership. I'm going to talk more about that, but you saw that after the George Floyd uprising, you saw a militant working class uprising that was immediately co-opted by the city council, and that was allowed by kind of the nonprofit class who put the city council in that position. And what we ended up with was a massively increased police budget and a failed charter amendment that really didn't mobilize and was already walking back abolitionist language. It happened with rent control. You saw the nonprofit class and city council members work to water down a renter-led referendum, and now we're in a position where rent control is in the city council's hands, and we know that this is not a city council that supports rent control by and large. Another takeaway I have from the last 4 years is the inability to provide political leadership coming from the DFL and from the nonprofit class. We need to internalize that, and we need to leave them in the dust, and we need to continue to build organizations on the ground that can provide real leftist political leadership, ideas, energy, and organization. So that's my quick little look back at the Frey Bender years. Would love to hear your thoughts. We're closing out 2021, looking forward to 2022. Keep your head up, keep your heart strong. Money, power, land, solidarity.
More than that. We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building up